The poor student had only $60 for her first date, but she never expected to become the cruel joke of a bad boy from the same school. Claire Miller walked into the restaurant with her heart racing, both hands clutching the worn-out purse. Inside it was all the money she could spare for tonight. The equivalent of a whole week working part-time at the library and the small grocery near her dorm. She had hesitated for many days before daring to nod in agreement. Claire sat down, adjusting the hem of her dress. She was a third-year nursing student, shuffling daily between lectures and part-time shifts at the library. Her meager income was just enough to pay rent for the boarding room and buy a few used books. Since her mother passed away, Claire had lived a quiet, secluded life, circling between books and endless hours of part-time jobs, rarely stepping into the world of parties or dates. Friends used to tease that she might graduate without ever experiencing a single romantic dinner. That was why sitting here, in her mother's old cream-colored dress and with $60 in her purse, was a leap she had never dared to take before. The small candlelight on the table cast a glow on her youthful yet anxious face. 6:45 in the evening, Claire had arrived 15 minutes early, the habit of someone who never allowed herself to be late. She unlocked her phone, eyes pausing on the message he had sent the previous week. "I'm really looking forward to tonight with you." Those words had made her nervous for an entire week, thinking about this date every morning when she woke up. And just this afternoon, he had texted again. "Tonight is going to be great for sure." A short sentence, but enough to give her the courage to step into this elegant place, believing that this time things would be different. Time dragged on. 7 o'clock, then 7:15. Claire bit her lip and sent another message. "I'm here already. Are you on your way?" No reply. At 7:30, her phone lit up. Her heart pounded wildly, but the flicker of hope was extinguished in seconds. The message appeared. "Ha ha ha! You actually came? I bet with my friends that I could trick the poor bookworm into leaving the library. Looks like I won the bet. Who would ever want to date someone like you?" Claire's eyes blurred. Every laugh and chatter from the surrounding tables suddenly sounded piercing, each note like a knife. She sat frozen, trembling fingers gripping the white napkin. In that moment, she only wished she could vanish from this candlelit room, where everyone seemed to be paired up, while she had been turned into a mockery. At the nearby table, James Whitmore set down his glass of wine. He had been sitting alone since earlier, only intending to have dinner after a long day of meetings. But ever since Claire walked in, his eyes had unconsciously followed her. He had seen the nervousness in her clumsy gestures, the small flame of hope flicker and die out when her phone lit up. And now, as her face stiffened to hold back tears, James suddenly remembered his own years of being an orphan. Nights waiting for someone to show up, but only met with cold silence. Claire stood up, shoulders trembling slightly, hand gripping the strap of her bag as if clinging to the last shred of dignity. She was about to leave, to end this humiliating evening. But just then, the waiter approached, placing before her a steaming plate of pasta and a clear glass of lemonade. Claire's eyes widened in confusion. "Excuse me, I didn't order this." The waiter only smiled. "It's already been paid for." She froze, heart racing, afraid it was another cruel prank. Then a deep male voice sounded behind her, warm and steady. "It's not pity. It's just a reminder. You deserve to be here, even if someone tries to make you think otherwise." Claire turned around. A man in a gray suit, calm demeanor, eyes steady yet gentle, pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. No pity, no flirtation, only sincerity. In the moment she thought she was utterly alone, Claire realized that in front of her was a stranger who had quietly placed back a reason for her to stay. A week after that humiliating evening at the restaurant, Claire walked into a small cafe next to the library. She only intended to buy a latte to go before class. The morning atmosphere was quiet, the scent of roasted coffee beans filling the warm room. Claire opened her purse, the crisp bills neatly arranged, the meager sum she had saved from her library shifts. As she placed them on the counter, a deep male voice sounded behind her. "Add a cappuccino for her. I'll pay together." Claire froze, lifting her head to look at the barista, then turned around. James Whitmore had just walked in, white shirt sleeves rolled up, looking far more casual than that night at the restaurant. He gave a slight nod as a greeting, then handed his card to the staff. Claire, flustered, asked, "You? Why?" James only gave a faint smile, his eyes calm. "Morning coffee is always a must, don't you think, Miss Claire?" He said nothing more, simply took the receipt and went over to the window seat where his laptop was waiting. Claire held her warm latte in hand, hesitating for a few seconds. She could leave right away as planned, but something urged her to step closer to his table. "You remembered my name?" she asked softly. James looked up, his eyes briefly lighting. "I remembered your courage, too. A name is much easier." Claire fell silent for a moment. She was used to jokes, even ridicule, but this was the first time someone had called her presence courage. They sat there, not needing many words. The early sunlight streamed through the glass, falling softly on the pages of the book Claire had brought. James shared a few small stories about work, the time his company was harshly criticized by a blogger and the whole team survived on pizza for a week. He spoke with humor, without a trace of boasting. Claire laughed, so lightly that even she was surprised, as if some long-settled dust inside her had just been brushed away. From that day on, the cafe became the place where they happened to meet again. Not a date, nor long conversations. Sometimes they simply sat at the same table, exchanging a few words about a medical journal Claire was reading, or James asking what she thought of a marketing slogan. Claire realized that he didn't look at her as a struggling student, but as someone whose opinion was worth listening to. One rainy afternoon, the cafe nearly empty, James suddenly asked, "Why did you choose nursing? It's a tough field. Not many have the patience to pursue it." Claire was silent for a moment before replying, "Because I want to be beside those no one else wants to be with. The sick, the children, the ones considered burdens. I think they deserve to be heard." James nodded slowly, his gaze turning distant. Claire asked in surprise, "What are you thinking about?" He sat still for a few seconds, then spoke softly. "I know that feeling. Because I'm also trying to be a father on my own. My daughter is 5 this year. Sometimes I feel helpless, not knowing how to make up for what she's missing." Claire was stunned. She had never imagined this man carried such a burden. James didn't add more, only looked down at his half-empty cup of coffee. In Claire's eyes, he was no longer just the successful man who happened to help her keep a shred of dignity, but also a solitary father struggling to love his daughter fully. From that day on, the distance between them grew shorter. Claire still held back, reminding herself he belonged to another world. Yet each time she left the cafe, she felt lighter, as if she had been given strength. James, in turn, was surprised to realize, in the quiet resilience of the young student, There was something that made him want to open his heart a little more, even if only just a little. One early autumn afternoon, as Claire was leaving the library, she caught sight of James walking in with a little girl of about 5. The child had soft brown hair tied to the side and wide eyes that shimmered with an unusual wariness. James held his daughter's hand, gently coaxing, "We're just borrowing a few books, Sophie. You'll like it." Hearing this, Claire paused for a moment. She knew James had a 5-year-old daughter, but this was the first time she had seen the girl outside of his brief mentions. In her imagination, she still could not picture what a composed James in the business world would look like beside his daughter. Sophie hid behind her father, her dark eyes watching Claire with suspicion. James smiled and introduced, "This is Claire, Dad's friend at the library." "Claire, this is Sophie." She gave a small nod, keeping her voice gentle. "Hello, Sophie. What kind of stories do you like most?" The girl didn't answer, only tightened her grip on her father's hand. James shrugged slightly, as if to say, "She's always like this." Claire walked over to the children's shelf, pulled down a colorful comic book, placed it on the table near Sophie, then stepped away without pressing further. A little while later, as James was busy answering a phone call, Sophie curiously dragged her chair closer to Claire. The girl laid a tiny finger on Claire's hand and whispered, "Your hand is warm." "Like my mom's." Claire froze, her heart tightening. She turned and saw in the girl's eyes a longing that had never faded. Struggling to keep her voice soft, she replied, "Your mom must have had the gentlest hands." Sophie nodded, pressing her lips together as if holding something back. James ended his call, and when he looked up to see this moment, he paused. He said nothing, only watched his daughter reach out to a stranger for the first time in many months. From that day, Sophie began to accept Claire's presence. The next time they met at the library, the girl tugged at Claire's sleeve, whispering, "Can you read to me?" Claire opened the book, her voice steady, light as breathing. Sophie listened intently, her eyes brightening, her head leaning against Claire's shoulder before she even realized it. James watched from afar, a strange feeling stirring inside him, gratitude mixed with fear. He knew he couldn't stop his daughter from seeking a mother's presence, but he also didn't want Sophie to place her trust in the wrong person. One evening, when rain suddenly poured down, James drove past the dormitory and saw Claire hurriedly shielding her head with her backpack. He pulled over, lowered the window. "Get in. I'll drive you home." Claire hesitated for a moment, then slid into the back seat. Sophie sat beside her, clutching a stuffed bear. The whole ride, the girl said nothing, but just before getting out, she mumbled, "Will you be at the library tomorrow?" Claire smiled. "Of course. I'll save you the best seat." Their meetings grew more frequent. Claire helped Sophie choose books, sometimes teaching her to write letters or draw little pictures. At first, James kept his distance, but gradually he felt lighter each time he heard his daughter's laughter. One night, Sophie came down with a slight fever, and James panicked, torn between an urgent meeting and caring for her. Desperately, he called Claire. "I'm sorry, but could you stop by and help me?" Sophie only falls asleep when someone reads to her. Claire came, bringing along a children's book. She sat by the bed, reading with a steady rhythm, giving each character a voice. Sophie slowly relaxed, her tiny hand touching Claire's, whispering in her half-dream, "Mom used to read like this." James stood in the doorway, his eyes red. Since his wife's passing, he had never seen his daughter sleep so peacefully. When Claire closed the book, James stepped inside and said, softly, "Thank you." I can't remember the last time Sophie laughed this much. Claire looked at him, catching the rare vulnerability in the eyes of a man usually so composed. "Children don't forget love," she replied gently. "They just wait for someone to remind them of it." James turned away, his hands clenching. Her words struck deep inside him, the place he had always feared, the fear that he could never fill the emptiness Sophie's mother had left. But tonight, seeing his daughter sleeping peacefully under Claire's warm hand, he began to believe that maybe he wasn't completely powerless. Since the night Sophie had fallen asleep to Claire's storytelling, the door between them had opened a little wider. James began to notice his daughter often asking, "When will Miss Claire come again?" That innocent question left him both happy and uneasy. Happy because Sophie had found her smile again. Uneasy because he feared Claire might see him as selfish for letting her fill such a vast emptiness. But Claire did not retreat. She continued stopping by the Whitmore house, sometimes bringing another children's book, sometimes helping Sophie with a few small exercises. Each time she stepped into the vast home where only father and daughter moved about, Claire could feel the absence of family warmth more sharply. She did not try to replace or compensate, only stayed present, listening and accompanying. One afternoon, when Sophie had a fever, James hurriedly called the doctor, then paced anxiously. Claire rushed over right after class. She laid a hand on the girl's forehead, speaking softly. "It's all right. Just a little fever. You only need some rest." James stood at the doorway, watching Claire cradle Sophie in her arms while reading slowly, and felt tears slip down his cheeks. He thought of his wife, of the nights she sat beside their daughter's bed, humming softly. The pain of loss, a wound he thought long closed, suddenly throbbed again. But strangely, no longer with sharp coldness, but softened by Claire's gentle breath. Another time, James came home late from a long meeting. When he stepped inside, he found Claire and Sophie sitting on the living room floor, papers and crayons scattered everywhere. Sophie excitedly announced, "I drew our family." In the childish drawing was a house with 3 figures, one tall, one shorter, and one tiny, holding their hands. James looked at the picture, his throat tightening. Claire seemed a little flustered, but Sophie innocently pulled both their hands together. "Daddy, sit down so I can color your hair too." Those simple moments became medicine for all 3 of them. James, once haunted by loss, for the first time felt that home was not just walls, but laughter echoing. Claire, the poor girl so full of self-doubt, began to believe she could bring something precious to others, not only in a hospital, but right inside a family. And Sophie, the 5-year-old, who had once, hidden in silence, slowly opened her heart, calling Miss Claire in her chirping voice, sometimes unconsciously leaning against her hand for warmth. One weekend morning, the 3 went to the park together. James rarely had time to take his daughter out, but that day he had invited Claire along. Sophie ran ahead, stopping at the ice cream cart. Claire bent down, asking which flavor she wanted. Sophie pointed. "Strawberry, like Mom liked." The words made James falter, but Claire quickly replied, "Then I'll have strawberry too, so today we can be like your mom." Sophie beamed, her tiny hand clasping Claire's tightly. That night, when James drove Claire home, he hesitated. "I don't know how to say this properly, but thank you. Since you came, Sophie has changed so much." Claire shook her head lightly. "I haven't done anything. I've only been here." Maybe what Sophie needs is the reassurance that love is still around her. James looked at her, his eyes darkened by years of sorrow now lit with a faint warmth. Even so, inside Claire there remained an invisible distance. She kept reminding herself James belonged to another world, wealthy, successful, while she was only a poor student struggling to secure a scholarship to continue her studies. Yet every time Sophie held her hand, every time James released a simple but heartfelt remark, that distance narrowed a little more. One evening, as Claire returned late from a library shift, James was waiting at the gate. He held out an umbrella, rain pattering on his shoulders. "You shouldn't be walking home in this rain." Claire took the umbrella, replying softly, "If I couldn't stand the rain, I probably wouldn't make much of a nurse." James laughed, not a boastful laugh, but the rare sound of mirth from a man long accustomed to silence. Those days were not loud, not marked by grand confessions or promises, only by a string of small moments stitched into a warm picture. A hand placed gently on a shoulder, a bedtime story told, a childish drawing of three people, all of them helping to sew together the wounds inside their hearts. In the days that followed, the sight of Claire beside James and Sophie became familiar. The small library near campus was no longer just her place of study, but also a natural meeting point for the three of them. Sometimes James stopped by to pick up his daughter, and then took all three to lunch. Other times, Claire could be seen with Sophie in the park, patiently teaching her to write each letter. To them, these were nothing more than ordinary fragments of life. But to outside eyes, they carried a different meaning. One evening, in a private student Facebook group, a blurry photo taken from afar was posted. In the picture, James was sitting at a diner. Claire and Sophie beside him, all three smiling. The caption was short but malicious. "The poor bookworm has found her shortcut. Clinging to a CEO to change her life. Fast, isn't it? Within hours." The post was flooded with comments. Some sneered, "Thought she was such a studious one. Turns out she knows how to climb, too." Others were crueler. "No wonder she's always around him. Must be getting a secret scholarship." Though there were a few voices defending her, they were quickly drowned in waves of mockery. Claire stumbled upon the post while reviewing for exams at the library. She read and reread each line, her eyes blurring. Moments that had been nothing more than simple happiness now stood as evidence for public humiliation. She shut off her phone, clutching her chest as if to shield herself from the knife cutting into her pride. All evening, she couldn't bring herself to answer any of James's messages, nor did she go to his house as usual. The next day, she walked into class with dark circles under her eyes, trying to avoid everyone's gaze. But whispers followed her down the hallway. "That's her. Didn't think she had it in her to hook a CEO." Claire quickened her pace, heart racing, each step growing heavier. In her mind, a single thought repeated. She was nothing but a joke once more, just like on that very first date. James noticed the change. Claire withdrew, found excuses to avoid the times he invited her over to see Sophie. She claimed she was busy with school, busy with shifts, but to James her retreat was plain. He didn't know the reason until one of his employees, an alumnus of the same school, sent him a screenshot of the group. "I thought you should know." "They're hurting her," the employee said. James read each comment, his usually composed face darkening. Anger surged within him, mixed with regret. He understood why Claire was pulling back. A girl who had already endured so much ridicule was now being publicly stoned. He called her, but she didn't pick up. The message he sent was answered with only a short line. "I'm fine. Don't worry about me," but James knew it wasn't the truth. In her cramped boarding room, Claire sat in silence for hours. She remembered Sophie's eyes when she held her hand, James's deep voice as he spoke of his orphan childhood. But all those warm memories now only filled her with fear. "I don't belong in their world. Sooner or later, everyone will think I'm taking advantage." The thought gnawed at her, leaving her choking back tears. She thought of pulling away completely, cutting off all contact so no one could say anything further. Yet deep inside, Claire knew leaving James and Sophie would not be easy. The little girl's smile, the tiny hands clutching hers on that feverish night, those things still remained. And so the struggle inside her only grew more painful. Meanwhile, James quietly formed a plan. He had already been invited to speak at the school's annual ceremony, a gathering of donors, professors, and students. Originally, he had planned to talk about medical projects and scholarships. But after learning of the rumors, James decided he would do something else. Not just a speech, but an opportunity to defend Claire in front of every doubtful eye. The university's annual ceremony arrived on a late autumn afternoon, the air chilly, the wind sweeping through rows of trees shedding their leaves. The grand hall glowed with lights, solemn as hundreds of students, professors, and benefactors gathered. On stage hung the familiar banner, 5 years, Whitmore Scholarships and Medical Research. James Whitmore was the most anticipated face of the event. Claire sat in the very back row, trying to blend into the crowd. She had not intended to come, but her advisor required every student to attend. From the moment she stepped into the hall, she felt the whispers, the discreet glances that quickly turned away. The photos, the comments from the private group still hovered around her like a shadow. Claire lowered her head, hands clutching the edge of her notebook. She wanted to disappear, but her feet would not move. The host announced, "Please welcome Mr. James Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Nutrition, our benefactor for the past 5 years." Applause rang out, but to Claire it sounded like hammers pounding against her chest. She saw James walk to the podium, tall and steady in a simple gray suit. He didn't search for her in the crowd, but Claire knew every word he was about to say would concern her. James began in his deep, even voice. "5 years ago, I created this foundation not for my name to appear on a plaque, but for a personal reason. I was once an orphan. I grew up on small scholarships, on donated meals from people I had never met. One of them told me, 'If one day you can stand strong, give back to others.'" He paused, letting silence settle. "And that is why I chose to sponsor education and healthcare. Because I believe that with just one opportunity, a life can change." Claire was stunned. She had known James as a successful man, but never realized he was the CEO who had funded the school for years. In that moment, all the whispers, the probing stares returned like a wave. She felt so small, so out of place in the resplendent hall. They weren't wrong. I looked no different from someone clinging for advantage, Claire thought shakily. The gap between her and James suddenly felt like an unbridgeable chasm. He on a lit stage, she only a poor student shrinking in the shadows. Then James continued, "Recently I've heard about rumors surrounding a student here. A hard-working, quiet girl who only wants to study to become a nurse, to stand beside a patient's bed and say, 'You don't have to suffer alone.' Yet she has been mocked, her worth questioned, simply because she sat at the same table with me. His voice dropped, firm and resonant. That is not only unfair to her, it betrays the very spirit of this scholarship. The hall fell utterly silent. Claire bowed her head, her heart pounding as if it would burst. His words exposed the very wound she had been trying to hide. Inside her, two forces tore at each other. The shame of, "I don't deserve this," against the flood of emotion at being publicly defended for the first time. James drew a breath, his eyes sweeping the hall. "I want to make it clear. Claire Miller does not need me to be here. I need students like her. Because it is their curiosity, their integrity, and their courage that convince me the future still holds hope. If you think a person's worth comes from connections, perhaps you have never sat long enough to listen to the heart of a student like Claire." His final words rang out, sharp and clear, each one like a nail driven in. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then applause broke from one corner, spreading wider until the entire hall stood. Claire sat frozen, tears streaming down her face. In that instant, she felt both exposed and lifted, as if James had taken her hand and pulled her out of the darkness. James stood there, not looking directly at Claire, but his eyes shone with resolve. He didn't need to seek her in the crowd, because he knew his words had already reached her heart. When the ceremony ended, Claire quietly stepped into the cold wind filling the wide hallway. Near the door, James was already waiting, tall and still amid the dispersing crowd. He didn't rush toward her, only let his steady gaze follow. As Claire drew near, he spoke gently. "I know this must have been uncomfortable for you, but I couldn't stay silent when the truth was twisted. You deserve to be defended." Claire stopped, her reddened eyes trembling as she whispered, "I never thought I was worth that much." James stepped closer, his voice firm yet warm. "You always have been." It just needed someone to say it out loud. Claire lowered her head to wipe her tears, and in that moment, she felt the invisible chains binding her finally loosen. The fear, the shame, the mocking voices were still there, but no longer pressed down as before. Because for the first time, she knew she was no longer alone. A week after the annual ceremony, Claire received an email from the scholarship office. She had been granted the chance to study for 1 year at a prestigious hospital, with all expenses covered. As she read the words, her heart clenched. This was what she had dreamed of, a door opening to a new future. Yet joy was quickly shadowed by fear. In her mind echoed the familiar mocking voice. "What's new about that? She only got it because she's close to the CEO." In the days that followed, Claire avoided James. She made excuses about being busy with classes, busy with her part-time jobs, but in truth, it was fear. Fear of looking into his eyes, fear of feeling so small beside such a successful man. Fear even when she thought of Sophie, the innocent child who had placed in her a simple trust she worried she couldn't return. At last, James asked to meet her at their familiar cafe. When Claire arrived, Sophie was there too, sitting beside her father with a comic book in her arms. James looked at Claire, his smile steady. "I think we should talk." Claire sat down, her hands tightly entwined. She drew a deep breath, then spoke frankly. "I received the scholarship, but I'm afraid if I go away, people will only believe even more that I don't deserve it. They'll say I only got it because I know you." Her voice grew smaller, her eyes cast downward. James was silent for a moment, then slowly said, "I know how much those words hurt you, but Claire, You don't have to prove anything to anyone. That scholarship is yours through your own effort. And if someone is blind to that, I'll be the one to remind them. But Claire, I want you to go. Because it's your dream, and because Sophie needs an example to believe that dreams are real. Sophie's eyes widened. She tugged at Claire's sleeve, her voice innocent. Miss Claire, if you go study, will you come back to me? Claire hugged the little girl tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks. James placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze gentle. I hope so too. In that moment, Claire understood that love did not need grand confessions. It was in the trust James placed in her, in the longing in Sophie's eyes, in the unconditional acceptance they both had given her. 1 year later, the airport was packed with people. Claire walked out of the international terminal, a backpack slung over her shoulder, her eyes shining with new confidence. She was no longer the timid student she once had been, but a young nurse who had spent a year of rigorous training, ready to step onto the long road ahead. At the far end of the hall, Sophie dashed toward her, wrapping her arms around her, chattering about new drawings she had made, about her first day in senior kindergarten. James stood behind, tall and composed as ever, but the corners of his eyes glowed with joy. Claire bent down to kiss the girl's hair, then lifted her gaze to James. He stepped closer, not carrying flowers or gifts, only a small box in his hand. Inside was a simple silver ring, gleaming under the warm lights. James looked straight into her eyes, his deep voice steady. I can't promise to make everything easy, but I promise from now on you'll never be alone again. Be my wife and Sophie's mother. Will you? Claire broke down in tears, nodding as the surrounding travelers softly applauded. James pulled her into his arms. Sophie squeezed in between them, laughing with delight. The three of them held hands, stepping out of the airport into the bustling stream of people. But in their hearts, time seemed to slow. Because in that moment, they were no longer three separate souls, but a true family. Perhaps each of us has, at some point, been a little like Claire, lost amid rumors, doubting our own worth, and secretly wishing for a hand to hold ours, reminding us that we are still enough. James did that for Claire, and Claire, in turn, did that for Sophie. A circle of healing was completed, not through grand romantic promises, but through patience, trust, and simple love. Their story reminds us that sometimes what someone needs is not perfection, but a person willing to stand up, to believe, and to stay by their side. And that true love does not make us feel like a burden. It makes us realize our worth. If this story has touched you, please like, subscribe, and share it to spread the belief that every wound can be healed through compassion and sincerity. Who knows? Somewhere near you, there may be a Claire or a Sophie waiting for someone like you to step forward.